Story 1. The Hum in the Forest. Alright everyone, the first story we're diving into tonight comes from a viewer. And it's a chilling reminder that sometimes the most beautiful and remote places hide the most unsettling dangers. This is a story about a camping trip that started out perfectly, but descended into a nightmare. And it explains why the man who sent it in has never been able to bring himself to sleep in the wilderness again. The story begins about 6 years ago. The narrator, who we'll call Alex, was 22, and his cousin, Cody, was 23. They were avid campers, often taking advantage of their odd work schedules to go on trips in the middle of the week. Their destination this time was Arapahoe National Forest in Colorado. For Alex, it was new territory, but Cody, an Eagle Scout and the seasoned outdoorsman of the pair, had been there before. Alex was always happy to let Cody lead the way. He handled the navigation, the planning, and the heavy lifting when it came to campcraft. After parking near a picnic area, they hiked for about 15 minutes, leaving civilization behind until they found a suitable clearing. It was an ideal spot, just enough open space for their 2 tents, a portable stove, and a campfire. They immediately set to work. Cody, with his years of experience, had his tent pitched in minutes. Alex, by his own admission, struggled for a good 20 minutes. A familiar routine that they both found amusing. With their shelters up, they built a stone fire ring and gathered wood. As the sun began its slow descent, casting long dramatic shadows through the trees, they had a healthy fire crackling, warding off the encroaching chill. Cody, the designated chef, started grilling steaks and burgers. The aroma of cooking meat filled their small clearing, a comforting scent in the vast wilderness. They kept their bear spray nearby, a standard precaution, but Cody always maintained that the real threat in the woods wasn't the animals. He often said, "The real thing you gotta worry about out here is other people." Alex never gave the warning much thought before this night. Dinner was perfect. They sat by the fire, eating their steaks and burgers, playing some classic rock on a small speaker. It was the quintessential camping experience, just two cousins enjoying the peace of the wilderness, reminiscing under a sky slowly filling with stars. Afterwards, they pulled out a small folding table for a few hands of cards, eventually switching to a game of Uno. It was during this light-hearted game that the entire atmosphere of the night shifted. That's when they heard it. At first it was faint, almost imperceptible, but then it became clearer, the distinct sound of a person humming. It was accompanied by the crunch of footsteps on the forest floor, somewhere out in the pitch-black darkness just beyond the glow of their campfire. Alex immediately paused the music. In the sudden silence, the sounds were undeniable. A person was out there walking past their camp, humming loudly. Cody urged Alex to find a flashlight, but by the time he located it, the humming and footsteps had faded away. A cold knot of unease formed in Alex's stomach. He asked Cody if this was something to be concerned about. Cody, usually unflappable, admitted it was highly unusual for someone to be this deep in the woods, let alone to be walking by an active campsite at night, humming so audibly. They tried to return to their card game, turning the music down low, but the comfortable vibe was gone, replaced by a tense, watchful silence. They didn't have to wait long for the next disturbance. Suddenly, a large stick landed right in the middle of their campsite with a loud thud, making them both jump out of their skin. It hadn't just fallen from a tree. The angle and force were unmistakable. Someone had thrown it at them. Pretense of this being a coincidence vanished. Cody, now angry, jumped to his feet and started yelling into the darkness, shouting something like, "Whoever's out there messing with us, get a life." In response, they heard footsteps again, this time hurrying away from them. Alex was terrified. He told Cody they needed to pack up and leave, find another spot, anything. But Cody, thinking more practically, knew that packing up and hiking through the unfamiliar woods in total darkness was far more dangerous. They had their bear spray, which was the closest thing to a weapon they possessed. He told Alex to keep it by his side in the tent when they went to sleep. The rest of the evening was spent in a state of high alert. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, sent a jolt of adrenaline through them. They kept hearing branches cracking in the distance, noises that didn't sound like any animal they knew. It was clear they weren't alone. Eventually, they knew they had to get some sleep. They agreed to take turns keeping watch. Cody, being the protector, volunteered for the first shift. He said he'd stay up and read by the firelight. Exhausted and on edge, Alex crawled into his tent, zipped himself into his sleeping bag, and drifted into an uneasy sleep. He woke up sometime later in that disoriented, foggy state you're in when startled from a deep sleep. He wasn't sure what had woken him, but as his eyes adjusted, he saw it. A silhouette. A person's head was peering into the mesh opening of his tent.
Eyes.
In his groggy mind, his first thought was that it was Cody, waking him up to take his turn on watch. "Cody," he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. "Is it my turn?" The head didn't respond. Instead, it quickly pulled back, and Alex heard the distinct sound of his tent's outer zipper being pulled shut. The figure was gone. He laid back down for a second, but then a wave of absolute clarity washed over him. The footsteps he heard walking away didn't sound like Cody's. He called out his cousin's name again. Silence. With his heart pounding, Alex unzipped his tent and peeked outside. The campfire had died down to embers, and Cody was nowhere in sight. He scrambled out and went straight to Cody's tent, which was zipped up. He opened it and looked inside. There was Cody, fast asleep in his sleeping bag. The realization hit Alex like a physical blow. Goosebumps erupted across his skin. The person who had been looking in on him, just inches from his face, was a complete stranger. He violently shook Cody awake, and when his cousin finally came to, Alex managed to choke out the words, "Someone's here." It took Cody a moment to grasp the situation, but when he did, he grabbed his bear spray. He admitted he must have dozed off while reading. There was no way Alex was sleeping in his own tent now. Cody told him to grab his sleeping bag and join him. As Alex rushed back to his tent to retrieve it, he heard it again, that same goddamn humming, somewhere nearby in the darkness. He grabbed his bag, and they both scrambled back into Cody's tent, zipping it up tight and clutching their cans of bear spray. For the next few horrifying hours, Alex stayed awake while Cody slept. It was the longest, most terrifying stretch of time in his life. He eventually woke Cody, and they switched. When Cody woke him the final time, the first light of dawn was breaking through the trees. They didn't even speak about it. They just packed everything up with frantic speed, and as soon as it was light enough to see the path, they practically ran back to the car. The camping trip was over. It's been 6 years since that night. Cody has tried to get him to go camping a few times since, but Alex has never been able to. The image of that head in the darkness, silently watching him, is burned into his memory. Who was out there in the forest, stalking their campsite? What did they want? It's a question that still haunts him, a testament to Cody's chillingly accurate warning. The scariest things you'll find in the woods are unto the animals. It's the people. Story 2. The Thing in the Trees. The next story I have for you comes from a man who learned a hard lesson when his father had tried to teach him his whole life. You shouldn't be scared of ghosts. You should fear the living, because they can actually hurt you. Or, in this case, the things that seem to be living. The cabin was set to be put on the market, but there was about a month-long gap before it was officially listed, a period where it would sit empty. Seeing this as an opportunity to escape the weight of his grief and the drama at home, he decided to use that time to clear his head. He quit his job, packed up his snowboarding gear, grabbed his dog, a loyal companion named Midnight, and drove his dad's car up to the vacant cabin. The evenings were quiet, spent listening to music, playing PlayStation, or just sitting on the master bedroom's second-floor balcony, watching the snow fall. He had stocked up on supplies and was content in his solitude. The quiet and the cold were beginning to soothe his frayed nerves. The third day, however, is when things started to turn. A heavy snowfall kept him indoors, and it was during a trip outside with Midnight that he first noticed them. Footprints in the fresh snow surrounding the cabin. They looked semi-fresh, as if someone had been there within the last half hour. He could see they led away from his cabin and disappeared into the denser part of the forest. His initial thought was that maybe one of the nearby cabins wasn't as empty as he assumed. The sound had been so clear, so real. Was he going crazy? Was midnight just feeding off his paranoia? He tried to calm himself down, taking a long drag from his cigarette and letting his eyes adjust to the darkness. And that's when he saw it. In a massive pine tree. One that stood a little taller than the cabin and only about 20 feet from the balcony, there was a figure. It was a delicate, persistent sound, like someone drumming their fingernails against the pane. It went on for nearly an hour. The weirdest part, he said, was the feeling that came with it, a strange psychic pull, an invitation to open the door. But at the same time, he could almost hear his late father's voice in his head, a clear, stern warning. Stay in bed. Don't do it. He listened to that voice. And his father, in a way, saved his life one last time. Story 3. The Facebook Marketplace trap. This next story is a modern-day cautionary tale. A chilling account sent in by a viewer that serves as a stark reminder that when an online deal seems too good to be true, it very, very often is. It is about how a simple attempt to buy a used phone nearly led him and his friend into a meticulously planned trap in the middle of nowhere. Our narrator begins his story by explaining that this happened a while back when iPhones still had home buttons. He was scouring Craigslist and Facebook Marketplace looking for a good deal on a replacement phone. He eventually stumbled upon a listing for a brand new factory-sealed iPhone for about $300. For the time, it was an incredible price, almost suspiciously low, but the allure of the deal was too strong to ignore. He reached out to the seller, a guy who called himself Melvin. Over text, Melvin seemed perfectly normal, even nice. He was easy to talk to, answered all the questions, and even sent a video of the phone's box, still in its plastic seal. The only hiccup was the location. The original ad listed a town much closer to our narrator. But Melvin claimed he had only been there in the morning and was now about an hour's drive north. It was an annoyance, but the deal was just too good to let a little extra driving get in the way. Not wanting to make the 2-hour round trip alone, he started asking friends if they wanted to come on an adventure. His way of making the boring drive sound more appealing. His friend Martina agreed to come along, but only on the condition that he buy her dinner for her trouble. With his co-pilot secured, he finalized the plans with Melvin. This is where the first layer of the trap was laid, disguised as a safety measure. Melvin insisted that he only conducts his sales in the parking lots of police precincts to avoid scams. For the narrator, this was a massive relief. It seemed like a smart, cautious approach and washed away any lingering doubts he had about the deal. It made the whole thing feel legitimate and, most importantly, safe. So later that evening, around 8:30 p.m., he picked up Martina and they set off. The hour-long drive was fine at first, filled with the easy conversation of good friends. But as they got off the highway and closer to the destination, the landscape began to change. They found themselves on quiet, secluded roads, winding through dense, wooded areas with only the occasional house or building to break up the endless trees. They finally pulled into the police precinct, and their first sense of unease began to creep in. The parking lot was deserted, save for a few empty police cruisers. They did a slow loop around the entire building, but there was no sign of Melvin or his black Altima. The narrator decided to call him. Melvin picked up and, with an apologetic tone, explained that he was having car trouble just a little ways down the road. He asked if the narrator could come to him. He even had jumper cables. He sent his location, and when the narrator plugged it into his GPS, his unease sharpened into genuine concern. The location was a pin dropped on the side of a random, nameless road, surrounded on both sides by nothing but dark woods. While he was on the phone, Martina was in the passenger seat, shaking her head frantically. She knew this was wrong. But the narrator, blinded by the 2 hours of driving he'd already invested, felt a stubborn need to see it through. He told Melvin he would come. As they neared the location, they saw the reflective glow of another car's lights ahead. It was a black car, just as Melvin had said, parked on the shoulder. As they got closer, they slowed down, peering into the vehicle. It was too dark to see clearly, but they couldn't make out the silhouette of a person in the driver's seat or anyone standing outside. The car just sat there, waiting. The scene was something out of a horror movie, a deserted road, no streetlights, no other cars, and a convenient breakdown in the perfect place for an ambush. Martina just said, "Keep driving." This time, the narrator didn't argue. He knew she was right. He drove right past the black car, and almost immediately his phone began to ring. It was Melvin. He called over and over, but the narrator ignored every call. Then came the texts. The first one read, "I saw you just pass me. Why didn't you stop? Turn around." He ignored that, too, his foot pressing harder on the gas pedal. With the immediate danger seemingly behind them, Martina, in an attempt to lighten the mood, laughed it off and reminded him, "Okay, you still owe me food." So, the narrator found the nearest diner, and they stopped to decompress and grab a bite to eat. It was a small, quiet place, nearly empty even for a Friday night. They ordered coffees, and as the waitress walked away, the diner's door opened. A man in a dirty navy blue hoodie walked in and sat at the counter a few stools down from them. He kept glancing over at their table, and the narrator whispered to Martina, "Don't look now. But I think that might be the Melvin guy." A moment later, the woman behind the counter handed the man his coffee. He took it, and in a voice loud and clear enough for the whole diner to hear, he said, "Thank you, darling." It was him. It was the same distinct voice from the phone. The blood drained from the narrator's face, told Martina, "That's him. We need to pay and leave now." He waved the server over and whispered that they just needed the check for the coffees. She looked concerned, and as he spoke, he saw the man at the counter look over at them again. They downed their coffees, threw cash on the table, and walked as quickly as they could out of the building. As they scrambled into their car, Martina looked back through the diner window. "Oh my God," she said, "he's getting up." The narrator didn't wait to see more. He peeled out of the parking lot, noting a black car parked in the corner that could very well have been the one from the roadside. He sped down the road and got back on the highway, pushing the car well over the speed limit, just wanting to put as much distance as possible between them and that town. So there they were, on the side of a dark highway, changing a tire in the middle of the night, the final act in a disastrous and terrifying evening. They eventually made it home safe, but the experience left a permanent mark. They look back on it now as a crazy story, but they both know how close they came to driving straight into a trap, and how easily their adventure could have ended in a very, very different way. Story 4. The reunion. The next story I have for you is a chilling exploration of just how little we can know about a person, even one we're dating. It comes from a man who thought he was going to a party, but instead found himself walking into a situation so strange and unsettling that it felt like a scene from a psychological thriller. It's a powerful lesson in trusting your gut when every red flag is waving right in your face. Our narrator, let's call him Mark, had been seeing a woman named Phoebe for a few weeks. They had matched on a dating app, and she was about 4 years older than him. They'd been on to dates. The first was just drinks, a standard get-to-know-you affair. The second time, she had joined him and his group of friends for a weekend outing. He mentions that when he later asked his friends what they thought of her, their opinions were politely neutral. They described her as nice and kind of quiet, the kind of vague compliments people give when they do and want to be rude but are exactly enthusiastic. He would later find out what they really thought. A short time later, Phoebe invited him to an upcoming high school reunion party. She explained that she didn't want to go alone, and Mark, feeling like he owed her one after she'd made the effort to meet his friends, agreed to be her +1. Right away, though, the details were a little unusual. It wasn't an officially organized event held at a bar or a catering hall, as is typical. Instead, she told him it was being hosted by a very wealthy guy from her graduating class at his private home. When the Saturday of the party arrived, they drove to the address she gave him. The house was exactly as described. An impressive, fancy home with a long gated driveway. But as they pulled up, Mark noticed the first odd detail. For a party at a rich guy's house, there were no fancy cars parked anywhere in sight. He figured the owner must have parked his own car in the garage to make room for guests, but it still felt a bit strange. The second they stepped through the front door, the atmosphere felt wrong. Mark said he was hit with an immediate and overwhelming sensation that every single person in the room had turned to stare at them more specifically. A few people came up to greet Phoebe with hugs, but their attention quickly pivoted to Mark. Their questions went far beyond typical party small talk. It felt, he said, like an interrogation. They wanted to know his whole life story, what he did for a living, where he grew up, who he lived with. It was invasive and deeply uncomfortable. Phoebe eventually pulled him away, but only to introduce him to more people who subjected him to the same bizarrely personal line of questioning. As he looked around the room, another glaring inconsistency struck him. These people did not look like they were 28, which was the age Phoebe had told him she was. Many of them looked well into their 30s, some even older. When he quietly mentioned this to Phoebe, she just laughed it off with a casual, "Yeah, some of these people aren't aging too well." It was a flimsy excuse that did nothing to quell his growing unease. The party itself was the opposite of a celebration. There was no music playing, creating a heavy, almost somber silence, broken only by hushed conversations. The guests were dressed strangely, not in the way you'd expect from people in their late 20s. And through it all, the unnamed mystery host, the rich owner of this big house, was nowhere to be seen. Mark felt like he was under a microscope. The stares were relentless, cold, and analytical. He whispered to Phoebe how uncomfortable he was, and she replied, "It's probably because they're wondering who I brought." At the time, it was the only explanation that made any sense, but it didn't make him feel any better. The awkwardness was suffocating. He needed to get away even just for a minute. He told Phoebe he was going to the bathroom, but really he just wanted to escape that room and clear his head. He wandered through the giant, silent house, feeling completely out of place. Every person he passed paused to stare at him. Finally, he found the bathroom and locked himself inside. Leaning against the door and letting out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, he pulled out his phone and immediately started texting his friends, telling them how incredibly weird the whole situation was, and trying to figure out a way to convince Phoebe to leave early. They had only been there for about 45 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. A moment later, his phone buzzed. It was Phoebe. "Where are you?" He replied that he was in the bathroom and needed a minute, then followed it up with, "This party is really weird. I'm down to leave soon." She just texted back, "Why?" Before he could reply, there was a sharp knock on the bathroom door. His time was up. He quickly washed his hands and opened the door. The man waiting outside was one of the younger-looking guests. As Mark stepped out, the man leaned in and said in a very low, urgent voice, "You should leave. That girl isn't who she says she is." Mark froze. "Phoebe?" he asked, his mind racing. "Whatever she told you her name is," the man replied. Then asked, "What did she tell you this party was?" "High school reunion," Mark said. The man gave a small, chilling smirk. "Do these people look like they're going to a high school reunion?" he asked rhetorically. Then he delivered his final terrifying warning. "Trust me, leave sooner than later." With that, he stepped into the bathroom and shut the door. For a second, Mark considered knocking on the door, demanding a better explanation. But he didn't need one. His own gut had been screaming at him that something was wrong for the past hour. This stranger had just given him the validation he needed. This wasn't just awkward. It was something else entirely, something dangerous. He didn't hesitate. He didn't go back to find Phoebe. He walked straight for the front door, feeling the weight of a dozen pairs of eyes on his back. He got in his car, drove away, and didn't look back. As he drove, Phoebe started texting him, asking where he went. He didn't answer. When he got home, consumed by a need for answers, he looked up her number on white pages. The search results confirmed his deepest fears. The number was not associated with anyone named Phoebe. The name that came up was Claire Foster. And the address listed for Claire Foster was completely different from the one where he had picked Phoebe up. It all clicked into place. He had never actually seen her go into or out of a house. Both times, she had been waiting for him on the sidewalk. He sent her one last text. "I had to leave. I'm sorry." And then he blocked her number, severing the connection for good. When he told his friends the full story, they finally admitted their true feelings. They said they thought she was weird and off from the very beginning, but hadn't wanted to say anything. One of his friends joked grimly that it sounded like he was in the movie Get Out. To this day, he has no idea what that gathering truly was. A cult? Some kind of strange club? He'll never know. But he is certain of one thing. He walked into a situation he was not meant to walk out of. And a quiet warning from a stranger in a hallway may very well have saved his life. Story 5. The man downstairs. This next story is a particularly unsettling one, because it deals with the violation of the one place we are all supposed to feel safest, our own home. It's told from the perspective of a man looking back on a terrifying event from his childhood, an event that shattered his sense of security and revealed how a single simple mistake can open the door to a nightmare. For a child, a house is a fortress, and parents are its guardians. This is the story of what happened on the night the fortress was left unguarded. Our narrator was about 8 years old when this occurred. He was a late-in-life child with 2 older siblings who were both at least a decade older than him. This age gap meant that, for all intents and purposes, he often felt like an only child, especially at night when his siblings were out with their own friends. The night of the incident began with him being woken up by a commotion downstairs. It wasn't just noise, it was the sound of panic. He could hear his parents' voices, sharp and stressed. Being a curious kid, he cracked open his bedroom door and crept to the top of the stairway. Peeking down, he called out, "Mom? Dad?" His mother appeared at the bottom of the stairs, her face etched with worry. She didn't explain what was wrong. She just looked up at him and said firmly, "Go back to bed." He listened without question. He could tell by her tone that this wasn't the time for arguments. He heard the front door slam shut, and then the house fell into an unnerving silence. He assumed they had left, and being a child, he simply went back to sleep. Sometime later, he was awakened again. This time the sounds were quieter, more stealthy. He heard the front door close once more, followed by soft footsteps moving through the lower level of the house. There was no talking. His first logical thought was that his parents were back and were just trying to be quiet so they wouldn't wake him. Then he heard more specific sounds drifting up from the kitchen. The gentle click of drawers being opened and closed, soft clink of things being moved around in cabinets, and the unmistakable soft hum and click of the refrigerator door opening. This sequence of sounds led his 8-year-old mind to a new, perfectly reasonable conclusion. It must be his older brother, Chris. Chris was in his late teens at the time, already driving. It was at all unusual for him to come home late and rummage through the kitchen for a late-night snack. This explanation was so plausible that it completely erased any fear. He was just hearing the normal late-night sounds of his family. Eventually the kitchen noises stopped, and he heard footsteps begin to ascend the stairs. They grew louder and closer until they reached the landing at the top. The footsteps paused for a moment, and then turned, making their way directly to his bedroom door. The doorknob turned slowly, and the door opened with a soft creak. He didn't move or sit up. He was lying in bed facing the door, his eyes open. The hallway behind the door was dark. Whoever was moving around the house wasn't using any lights. All he could see was a dark, vaguely human-shaped mass silhouetted in his doorway. Still convinced it was a family member, he whispered out a list of names, starting with his brother. "Chris, Mom, Dad." When there was no reply, he asked, a little louder, "Who's there?" The figure didn't answer.
Us.
It just stood there for a few more seconds, a silent void in the frame of his door. Then, just as slowly and quietly as it had opened, the door was pulled shut, leaving him alone in the darkness once again. He was a little creeped out now, but still not terrified. He thought maybe it was his dad, just checking on him, and not wanting to wake him by speaking. A little while later, with no more sounds coming from downstairs, his curiosity overcame his mild unease. He slipped out of bed and tiptoed downstairs, keeping all the lights off just as the person before him had. As he approached the kitchen, he froze in the doorway. A tall figure was standing perfectly still in the middle of the room. Based on the size and shape, he was sure it was his father. "Dad," he said, his small voice cutting through the silence. A deep voice. A voice that was gravelly, unfamiliar, most definitely not his father's, replied with two simple words: "Go back upstairs." Pure, unadulterated terror washed over him. He didn't need to be told twice. He turned and ran, his bare feet slapping against the floorboards as he scrambled back up the stairs, dove into his bed, and pulled the covers over his head. His mind was reeling. Why did his dad's voice sound like that? The innocent logic of a child could yet fully grasp the alternative that the man in the kitchen was a complete stranger. He lay there, trembling, for what felt like an eternity. Then he heard the front door open again. This time, however, it was followed by a commotion he recognized, the familiar, worried voices of his parents. They were finally, truly home. He ran to the top of the stairs and they were shocked to see him awake. He asked them what had happened, and they explained that his brother Chris had been in a car accident. They had gotten a call from the hospital and had rushed out to see him. And then, with a dawning horror, he asked his dad if he had come into his room earlier. That's when he and his parents learned the terrifying truth. They had been gone for hours. The house had been empty, except for him. As he told them about the person at his bedroom door and the man in the kitchen, he watched his mother's face drain of all color. She began yelling at his father, a frantic, terrified anger in her voice. In their panicked rush to get to the hospital, his dad had forgotten to lock the front door. His father grabbed his gun and searched the entire house while his mother called the police. The rest of the night was a blur of flashing lights and questions from police officers. The intruder was long gone, and it seemed nothing of value had even been stolen. That, perhaps, was the most disturbing part. This person hadn't broken in to rob them. They had let themselves into the unlocked house, roamed freely, watched him sleep, and had even spoken to him. Why? What were their intentions? He never found out. But he will never forget the chilling sound of that stranger's voice in his kitchen, a voice that belonged to the man who was, for a few terrifying hours, the silent, unwelcome guest in his home. Story 6. The Overnight Caretaker, the next account. I'm going to share comes from someone who works in a field that requires an immense amount of patience and compassion, a direct care aid. This story is a harrowing reminder that even with experience, you can never be fully prepared for the unpredictability of the human mind, especially when it's clouded by illness. It's but a single night on the job, a night so terrifying that it was both the first and the last time she ever worked in that house. Our narrator, a woman with experience caring for individuals with developmental disabilities, took on a new, one-off overnight job. The client was a 65-year-old woman named Martha, who had a developmental disability compounded by dementia. Martha's daughter, Colleen, was in her 40s and worked an overnight shift. She needed a medically experienced caretaker to watch her mother while she was away, feeling it was a safer option than leaving her alone or in a nursing home. At the time, our narrator was working to other care jobs and was pushing herself to the limit to make ends meet, so the extra shift, while tiring, was welcome. She arrived at the house in the evening, just as Colleen was preparing to leave for work. Colleen introduced her to Martha, who offered a brief, pleasant smile. Before she left, Colleen gave her a crucial warning. She explained that Martha would sometimes wake up in the middle of the night and wander the house, often in a state of confusion. She was very specific that this was not sleepwalking. It was a symptom of her dementia. The narrator's job, if this happened, was to calmly guide her back to her room. With her professional experience, the narrator assured Colleen that she could handle it. After Colleen left, and Martha was settled in her upstairs bedroom for the night, the house fell quiet. For the first few hours, the job was exactly as expected, a lot of quiet sitting. The narrator settled into the living room to catch up on a TV show, a typical way to pass the long, silent hours of an overnight shift. Eventually, she heard the sound of footsteps from the floor above. She went to the bottom of the stairs, looked up, and called out, "Martha, do you need anything?" There was no answer, but she heard the footsteps retreat back towards the bedroom and a door close. She figured Martha had just used the bathroom and went back to her show. About an hour later, she got up to get a sandwich she had brought from the kitchen. As she walked out of the kitchen, plate in hand, She was so startled she nearly had a heart attack and dropped the plate, which shattered on the floor. Martha was standing silently in the doorway watching her. The crash of the plate seemed to trigger something in Martha. She began to yell, her voice loud and accusatory. "Who are you?" The narrator, despite her own shock, went into professional mode. She calmly reminded Martha who she was, the direct care worker hired by her daughter. But Martha's confusion had turned to agitation. "Why are you here? I don't know you," she screamed. The narrator kept her voice even, repeating that Colleen had hired her to watch the house. This seemed to break through the fog of her confusion, at least for a moment. She managed to gently coax the now calmer Martha back upstairs to her room. For good measure, she brought her a glass of water and some melatonin, hoping it would help her sleep through the rest of the night. Exhausted from her long day and the stressful encounter, the narrator decided to get a couple of hours of sleep herself. Colleen had told her she could use the bed in the spare bedroom upstairs. Believing the melatonin would keep Martha settled, she lay down and fell asleep almost instantly. She was only asleep for about an hour when a sound from downstairs jolted her awake. It was a loud, rhythmic slamming sound, repeating every second or two. She jumped out of bed, her heart pounding. She had left her bedroom door open specifically so she would hear if Martha got up, and now her precaution had paid off. She crept to the top of the stairs and realized the slamming was coming from the kitchen, moved down the stairs as quietly as she could. Peering around the corner into the darkened kitchen, she saw a scene that she says was straight out of a horror movie. In the dim light filtering in from the streetlights, she could see Martha's silhouette. She was standing in front of the oven, methodically opening the heavy door and slamming it shut over and over again, creating the percussive, jarring noise that had woken her. "Martha," the narrator said, her voice louder and sharper than she intended. Martha stopped. She turned her head slowly, looked directly at her, shut the oven door one final time with a deafening clang, and began walking towards her. As she approached the stairs, the narrator's professional calm began to crack. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice now a soft, scared whisper. Martha didn't answer. She walked right past her as if she wasn't there, her face a blank, emotionless mask, and proceeded up the stairs. The narrator followed her, and as soon as Martha reached her room, she slammed the door shut. The narrator knocked gently. "Martha, are you all right?" Silence. She quietly opened the door to peek inside, and saw Martha standing by the side of her bed, facing the wall, perfectly still. It was profoundly unsettling behavior. She gently approached her and managed to ease her back into bed, pulling the covers over her. She said goodnight one more time and retreated to the spare room, her nerves completely frayed. She tried to stay awake, listening for any other sounds, but her exhaustion was overwhelming, and she fell back asleep. She woke up again much later, this time to absolute silence. The room was pitch black. She lay there, listening, wondering what had disturbed her this time. Then she heard a soft sound from inside the spare room's closet. Her eyes darted to the closet door, and she saw that it was cracked open. Peeking out from the crack was the dark shadow of a head. Her breath caught in her throat. "Martha," she whispered. No answer. She kept repeating her name, her voice trembling, until the closet door was pushed fully open. Martha stepped out and began walking slowly towards the bed, her voice a low, threatening chant of the same words from before. "Who are you? I don't know you." As she got closer, the narrator reached for the lamp on the nightstand, her fumbling fingers finally finding the switch and flooding the small room with light, and at that moment, everything changed. In Martha's hand, held down by her side, was a huge kitchen knife. In that instant, Martha was no longer a patient. She was a threat. The narrator's training gave way to a primal need for survival. She screamed, "Martha, put the knife down!" The scream seemed to agitate Martha further. She got closer, screaming back, "I don't know you." The narrator knew there was no calming down a person in that state, especially not one who was armed. She quickly mapped out an escape route around the bed and went for it. She jumped off the side of the bed farthest from Martha, who swung the knife in a slow, weak arc through the air as she ran past. It was a clumsy swipe, but it was proof of her intent. She didn't stop running until she was out of the house. Standing in the cold night air, she called Colleen, as she had been instructed to do in an emergency. Colleen, not understanding the severity of the situation, started yelling at her not to leave her mother alone. The narrator yelled back, her voice shaking with adrenaline and fury, that her mother had just tried to kill her, and that she was doing her a favor by not calling the police. Colleen had to leave work, of course. The narrator waited outside, watching the house until she arrived. When Colleen went inside, she found Martha back in her bed, seemingly asleep. She even accused the narrator of exaggerating until she found the large kitchen knife lying on the floor next to her mother's bed. The narrator, wanting to avoid any more blame, never mentioned that she had been asleep in the spare room. She had been offered that room, and she knew that in Colleen's desperate state, she would latch on to any detail to shift the fault. She never worked in that house again. In her 9 years as a direct care aide, she had dealt with many difficult patients, but Martha was different. She was, without a doubt, the scariest. Use arrow up and arrow down to select a turn, enter to jump to it, and escape to return to the chat. Story 7. The Roommate. This next story is a chilling and deeply unsettling account that serves as a powerful cautionary tale for anyone who has ever considered finding a roommate online. It comes from a young woman who, out of financial necessity, moved in with a man she met on the internet. What began as a practical and seemingly safe arrangement quickly devolved into a psychological nightmare, proving that the person you share your home with can be a far greater threat than any danger lurking outside your walls. Our narrator was 23 years old, just starting a new chapter in her life. A job opportunity had required her to move to an entirely new state, a place where she knew no one. Faced with the high cost of living alone, she did what millions of people do. She turned to the web to find a roommate. She cast a wide net, posting on Facebook, Craigslist, and even the local subreddit, hoping to find a normal, respectable person to share a space with. Eventually, a man named Rob responded to her Facebook ad. He said he had a spare room in his house that he owned outright. Before proceeding, she did what she considered her due diligence, scrolling through his profile to get a feel for him. He looked like a regular guy, and she felt cautiously optimistic. Her parents, of course, were vehemently against the idea of her living with a man she'd never met. But she was an adult, determined to make her own decisions. To further vet the situation, she arranged a FaceTime call with Rob. He was friendly, articulate, and seemed completely harmless. He gave her a virtual tour of the house, which was modest, clean, and in a perfect location, only a 10-minute commute from her new office. The price was fair. His rules seemed standard, and he didn't give her a single bad vibe. It felt like she had found the perfect solution. A week later, she arrived with her car packed, ready to start her new life. Rob was there to greet her in person. He was shorter than she expected, about her height, and was perfectly polite, even helping her carry some of the heavier bags inside. He showed her to the furnished room, explaining that a friend had just moved out. She spent the day unpacking and settling in, replacing the old bedding with her own. Rob was around, making small talk, and his efforts felt like a genuine attempt to make her feel welcome and at home. There was nothing overtly flirtatious or strange about his behavior. He just seemed like a nice, accommodating roommate. The first hint that something was amiss came that first Sunday. Rob offered to drive her around town to show her the local spots. She wasn't particularly keen on the idea, but agreed, wanting to maintain a friendly atmosphere in the house. The tour started normally enough, but then Rob suggested they stop for a proper sit-down lunch. The suggestion felt loaded, less like a casual bite between housemates and more like he was trying to turn the outing into a date. Not wanting to send the wrong message, she politely told him she wasn't hungry. He immediately pivoted, suggesting they go for drinks instead. Again, she politely declined, using the excuse that she had worked the next day. It was her refusal that caused his mask to slip. His friendly demeanor evaporated, replaced by a pushy, insistent tone. "Come on, just a couple of drinks," he pressed. She held her ground, repeating that maybe another time would be better. He finally dropped it, but the change in him was stark and immediate. He fell into a deep, brooding silence for the remainder of the drive home. The warmth was gone, replaced by a cold, resentful energy that made the car feel small and suffocating. It was the first major red flag, a clear sign that his friendliness was conditional and that he did not handle rejection well. A few days later, the situation escalated from uncomfortable to deeply disturbing. After a long week at her new job, she went to do her laundry and was struck by the feeling that the clothes in her hamper had been shifted around. She tried to dismiss it, but as she loaded the clothes into the washer, a cold dread washed over her. She realized a pair of her underwear was missing. She meticulously searched her entire room, her panic growing with every empty drawer she checked. It was gone. The only possible explanation was as unthinkable as it was undeniable. Rob had gone into her room, rifled through her personal belongings, and stolen from her. The act was such an intimate and creepy violation that she felt physically ill. That was the moment she knew she needed a lock on her door. That weekend, while Rob was out, she went to the hardware store, bought a new doorknob with a key lock, and installed it herself. The simple act of turning that key for the first time gave her a profound sense of relief and security. She planned to tell Rob about it, but he didn't come home that night. Her newfound peace was shattered at 1:30 in the morning. She was jolted from her sleep by a violent, angry banging on her bedroom door. It was Rob shouting her name. She lay frozen in her bed, her heart hammering against her ribs, and pretended to be asleep. The next morning, a series of cold, demanding texts confirmed her fears. "We need to talk," he wrote. "It's about the doorknob. Comes off today." She tried to reason with him, explaining that as a woman living with a practical stranger, a lock made her feel safer.
Ice.
His response made it chillingly clear that her feelings were irrelevant. It was his house, and he would have access to every part of it. The terrifying implication hung in the air. The only way he could have known about the lock was if he had tried to get into her room that night while she was sleeping. Reluctantly, she removed the lock. The house no longer felt like a home. It felt like a cage. The final, terrifying confirmation of the danger she was in came a few days later. A woman her age knocked on the front door while Rob was away. It was a neighbor. She asked the narrator if she was Rob's new roommate, and then, with a grave expression, told her she needed to get out of there immediately. The neighbor revealed that Rob was a known stalker, a very dangerous and creepy man who had multiple restraining orders filed against him by other women. The narrator was floored, a wave of validation and pure terror washing over her. She wasn't just being paranoid. She was in real danger. She immediately started packing and found a new apartment. She then had to face Rob one last time, feeding him a story about a family emergency. To her relief, he seemed to buy it and agreed to refund her rent money. But just when she thought she was in the clear, he asked, "Did by some chance some girl say something to you?" She denied it, but she knew he was suspicious. The true horror came on her last night in the house. She awoke to the feeling of a presence in her room and opened her eyes to the stuff of nightmares. Rob was sitting silently on the end of her bed, watching her sleep. She screamed and he lunged, clamping his hand over her mouth. He whispered, "I knew someone said something to you. I don't believe what these girls say." As she lay there, paralyzed with fear, he did the unthinkable. He began to caress her leg. "I don't mean to scare you," he said, his touch a sickening violation. That was the final straw. She threw herself out of the bed and ran from the house, dialing 911 as she hid in the bushes. The police arrived and supervised as she retrieved the last of her things, forcing Rob to return her money on the spot. An officer quietly confirmed Rob's history, but lamented that without more proof, it was just her word against his. She left that night and never looked back, the experience having burned a new, unbreakable rule into her mind. She would never, ever live with a stranger again. Story 8. The woman at the door. This next story is a masterclass in trusting your gut instincts. Even when the situation is designed to make you feel guilty for doing so, it comes from a viewer who, as a teenager, found himself home alone and the target of a strange and increasingly persistent duo. It's a chilling reminder that predators can come in all shapes and sizes. Sometimes the most unassuming person can be the most dangerous. Our narrator was about 15 or 16 years old at the time. His entire family was out for the evening for a reason he can't quite recall, leaving him with the house to himself. He was a big gamer back then, and he was settled in for a long night of playing StarCraft on his computer, which was set up in his first-floor bedroom. He was deep in a match when the doorbell rang twice in quick succession. Annoyed at the interruption and worried about losing his game, he hurried to the front door. As he always did when he was home alone, he called out, "Who is it?" Before even touching the lock, the voice that came from the other side was soft and weak, and he couldn't quite make out what she was saying, but it sounded like an older woman. He opened the main door but kept the storm door sturdy, glass-pinned, door closed and locked, creating a barrier between himself and the person on his porch. Standing there was an elderly woman with a big, unwavering smile on her face. Her hands were held behind her back. "Can I help you?" he asked through the glass. She explained that she needed to use a phone and asked if she could please come inside. Now, ever since he was a little kid, his parents had drilled one rule into his head above all others. You never let a stranger into the house. No exceptions. That included women, elderly or otherwise. But in that moment, standing face to face with this smiling old woman, the rule felt harsh. He felt incredibly awkward and rude turning her away. Thinking quickly, he tried to redirect her, suggesting she go to the public library a few blocks down the road, knowing they would surely have a phone she could use.
Deep down,
He knew the library was almost certainly closed at this hour.
boss.
But he was a teenager in a very uncomfortable situation, just trying to make the problem go away without being overtly cruel. If the woman's smile didn't falter, but her next words were laced with a passive-aggressive venom that didn't match her pleasant expression at all. "That's very rude," she said, her voice still soft, to turn away an old lady asking for help. He fumbled for a response, falling back on the only excuse he could think of. "My parents don't allow strangers in the house. It's a house rule," he said, already starting to slowly close the main door. Sorry. The entire time, she just stood there, completely motionless, that wide, fixed smile never leaving her face. And as he shut the door, he realized that her smile no longer looked friendly. It looked menacing. He was walking back to his room, his heart beating a little faster than before, when the doorbell rang again. There was no way in hell he was answering it this time. That woman radiated weird vibes. Maybe something was wrong with her. Maybe she was confused. But his gut was screaming at him that this was not a simple case of a person in need. He went back to his game, trying to push the strange encounter from his mind. He hadn't been sitting for more than a few minutes when he heard a new sound. A tapping noise on the window of his bedroom, the very window right in front of his desk. It wasn't the sound of knuckles. It was a sharper, metallic clinking sound. The blinds were down, so he couldn't see who or what was making the noise, but he had a pretty good idea. His bedroom was the only room in the house with a light on, a beacon in the otherwise dark house. The horrible thought that the old woman had walked around the side of his house and was now standing right outside his window, trying to get his attention, terrified him. He immediately muted his computer. The game was forgotten. The clinking on the window persisted, a rhythmic, unnerving tap. He couldn't stay in that room any longer. He got up and retreated to the living room, sitting in the darkness, listening. A few moments later, the doorbell rang again, this time with more urgency. This was no longer a simple request for help. This was harassment. He tried to rationalize it, to tell himself she was just a confused old woman who didn't know what she was doing. But then the doorbell rang a second and third time in quick succession. He decided he had to do something. Maybe he could open the door again, with the storm door still locked, and offer to call someone for her. But when he got to the front door and looked through the peephole, the old woman was gone. In her place stood a man who looked to be about 10 years younger than her. He opened the main door, keeping the storm door locked. "Have you seen my mother?" the man asked through the glass. Relieved, the narrator replied, "Yes, she was just here a minute ago." The man immediately apologized, explaining that his mother has dementia and had gotten out of the house. Suddenly, the woman's strange behavior seemed to make sense, and the narrator felt a pang of guilt for having been so suspicious. But then the man asked, "Can I come in for a minute?" The request immediately put him back on high alert. Why did he need to come inside? The same awkward feeling washed over him, but this time, he was more resolute. He gave the same excuse he'd given the woman, explaining that he could just as easily talk through the locked storm door. He then told the man that he thought his mother might have gone into the backyard because he had heard a noise at his window. He told the man he was welcome to go around back and check. The man thanked him and walked down the front path, presumably heading towards the back of the house. The narrator went to a back window to watch, expecting to see the man searching for his mother, but the backyard was empty. There was no sign of the man or the woman. The whole situation was just too weird. He decided to call it a night, turning on the TV in his room to have some background noise as he tried to fall asleep. Just as he was starting to drift off, he heard it again. That same metallic clinking on his bedroom window. Remembering the supposedly concerned son, he thought maybe he could help. He went to the window, took a deep breath, and lifted the corner of the blind, and there she was, the old woman, standing just feet from him on the other side of the glass, that same wide, creepy smile plastered on her face. And in her hand, she was holding a kitchen knife, which she was using to tap rhythmically on the window pane. He dropped the blind and scrambled back into his bed, his blood running cold. This wasn't dementia. This was a threat. A few moments later, the doorbell rang 4 times, insistently. The clinking on the window had stopped. It all felt coordinated, like some kind of planned home invasion attempt. He stayed in his bed, ignoring the doorbell, determined to wait it out. He didn't have a cell phone at the time and was, for some reason, hesitant to call the police on the landline. He lay there in the dark, listening, until finally everything went quiet. The next morning, when he told his father what had happened, his dad praised him for not opening the door. They all agreed that every detail of the encounter, the woman's persistence, the man's attempt to get inside, the knife sounded like a well-rehearsed robbery attempt. Was it possible it was all a tragic misunderstanding? Maybe, but every question, why did the man want inside? How did he know she was at that specific house? Why did he never actually check the backyard? All pointed to a much more sinister conclusion. The narrator is convinced that if he had unlocked that storm door, he would have learned their true intentions firsthand. Story 9. Dennis's uncle. This next story is a heavy one. Comes from a man looking back on a traumatic event from his childhood. A day that should have been one of the happiest of the year, but instead became the most terrifying day of his life. It is a story about a wolf in sheep's clothing, and the chilling realization that the monsters we fear are not mythical creatures, but people. Because this story involves a child, I want to give a listener warning. This account is deeply disturbing. Our narrator, who we'll call Tommy, was in the 4th grade, and it was the last day of school. In his school district, 4th grade was the final year that elementary students had to be picked up by a parent. 5th graders were granted the freedom to walk home on their own. He had a play date planned with his friend Dennis to celebrate the start of summer vacation. His mom was scheduled to pick him up, as she always did. Dennis wasn't in Tommy's class that year, so when the final bell rang, they were dismissed into different hallways. Tommy's class lined up and walked to their designated exit, where they waited outside under the watchful eye of their teacher, a Miss Blue. He stood there, scanning the chaotic crowd of parents and shuffling cars, looking for Dennis's dad, who was supposed to be driving them. Suddenly, he heard his name being called. Tommy. Tommy. He looked over and saw a man waving at him as he approached. The man introduced himself as Dennis's uncle and explained that he was there to pick him up. Tommy, being a trusting 4th grader, simply went over to his teacher and said, "I'm being picked up." Miss Blue asked where his ride was, and he pointed to the man, who gave the teacher a friendly wave. With that, Miss Blue dismissed him, and he went with the man. The man led him quickly through the crowd. He was a very fast and jittery talker, with a slight stutter, and he walked so incredibly fast that Tommy, weighed down by his backpack, could barely keep up. He explained that Dennis's dad had to work later than expected, so he, the uncle, would be driving Tommy back to their house.
Ow.
They arrived at his car, a dark red hatchback. And it was only as he was getting into the back seat that Tommy registered the giant, glaring question that should have been obvious from the start. Where was Dennis? As if reading his mind, the man turned to look at him and said that Dennis was already at his house. Tommy was a shy kid, especially around adults he didn't know, and he wasn't the type to speak up if he was confused. But he was very, very confused. The story was already starting to feel wrong, the pieces not quite fitting together. The entire drive, the man kept up a constant stream of chatter, telling stories about his own elementary school days and asking Tommy questions about sports and school. The drive felt long, maybe 10 minutes. In his town, where houses were packed closely together, that was a significant amount of time. His own house was only a 5-minute walk from the school. He knew, with a sinking feeling in his stomach, that they were in an area of town he didn't recognize. The man finally parked in front of a normal-looking house and led him inside. The moment the door closed behind them, he heard the click of a lock. The inside of the house was shockingly dark. All of the curtains were drawn shut, blocking out the bright afternoon sun. The only source of light was a single dim lamp in the corner of the room, casting long, eerie shadows. The man turned to him and smiled. "Where's Dennis?" Tommy asked. his voice barely a whisper. The man's friendly demeanor suddenly shifted. He seemed nervous and jittery. "Oh, I think he's downstairs playing video games," he said. "Give me a second."
Wait here.
He then disappeared into a nearby room. Tommy heard a door open and the sound of footsteps descending into what he assumed was a basement. In that moment, a cold, primal fear took hold of him. His heart was racing. He knew he was in danger. He crept to the front door and quietly tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It was some kind of lock that needed a key. Panic began to set in. A small, desperate part of him still held out hope that Dennis really was downstairs and would be coming up the stairs any second. But the rational part of his brain knew the chances of that were slim to none. He was overwhelmed with regret for ever getting in that car, for ever walking into that house. He did the only thing his terrified 9-year-old mind could think to do. He went to the kitchen and found a phone hanging on the wall. He lifted the receiver, his hands shaking, and dialed 911. When the operator answered, he whispered, "Please come to this house. I've been kidnapped." The operator acknowledged him, but he didn't dare say another word. He hid the phone with the line still open under a dish towel in a corner of the counter and hurried back to the spot where the man had left him just as he heard footsteps coming back up from the basement. The man appeared at the top of the stairs and called his name. "Come on down, Dennis is down here." When Tommy didn't move or respond, there was a pause. The man came fully up the stairs and looked at him, his face a mask of false concern. "Are you okay?" he asked. Tommy felt sick. He was so scared and so angry at himself for being so naive. He looked at the man and asked in a small, trembling voice, "Can I leave?" The change in the man's face was instantaneous and terrifying. The friendly smile vanished, replaced by a cold, hard expression. He realized the charade was over. He walked towards Tommy, his movements gentle at first, until he was close enough to grab his wrist in an iron grip. He started aggressively pulling him towards the basement. Tommy screamed and cried, and the man screamed back at him, "I'll let you go if you stop and behave." So he stopped. He went limp and allowed himself to be led down the stairs. Halfway down, the door at the top of the stairs slammed shut behind him, and he heard it lock. He walked the rest of the way down into an empty, unfinished basement with a concrete floor and a single support beam in the middle. The only light came from one exposed, depressing yellow light bulb hanging from the ceiling. It was the kind of place you'd imagine in a nightmare. He could hear the man's heavy footsteps moving around upstairs. Didn't know what he was doing, but after a while, the man came back to the basement door and called down asking if he was hungry. Tommy said no, terrified that if the man went into the kitchen, he would see the phone was off its hook. The door was shut and locked again. He sat there in the terrifying silence, his heart in his throat, and then he heard it. The doorbell ringing 3 times upstairs, followed by loud banging sounds. It had to be the police. He waited, holding his breath, listening for the man's footsteps to approach the front door, but they never did. The banging and ringing continued, and then he heard a massive crash, followed by multiple heavy footsteps and shouting voices. He started screaming for help, pounding on the locked basement door with all his might. A moment later, the door was unlocked. A police officer on the other side grabbed him and hurried him outside to a scene of flashing lights and at least 3 cop cars. The man was brought out of the house in handcuffs, and that was the last time Tommy ever saw him. He later learned the man was a work associate of Dennis's father. He had somehow found out that Dennis's dad was picking both boys up from school that day and had seized the opportunity. How he knew what Tommy looked like is a detail he never learned, a question he never wanted the answer to. This happened over 17 years ago. He knows that. For all he knows, that man might be out of prison now. But he is also certain of one other thing. If he hadn't thought to dial 911 before he was thrown in that basement, he would not be alive today to tell the story. Story 10. The Rocking Chair. All right. For the last story of the night, we're shifting gears a little bit. We've heard tales of human monsters and terrifying encounters, but this final account brushes up against something else entirely. It's a story about a party, a strange noise, and a discovery in a basement that defies any logical explanation. It comes from a man who, on New Year's Eve, believes he and his friends encountered something from beyond the veil of the living. The night was New Year's Eve of 2020. The world was collectively desperate to put that horrible year behind it, and our narrator was ready to celebrate its end. His friend Logan was hosting a house party. The narrator arrived early to help set things up. Since Logan's parents were out for the night, he had already secured a spot to crash in their room. This meant he could drive to the party and drink without worrying about getting home, a perfect setup for a long night of celebration. The party was a good mix of people. Most of their close friend group was there, along with a bunch of Logan's other friends who the narrator didn't know. The house was full of music and laughter, a typical high-energy house party. At midnight, the countdown ended with the obligatory screams of Happy New Year and the clinking of glasses. After that, as is common with New Year's parties, the crowd began to thin out. People started to leave for other parties, head to the bars, or just go home. As the night wore on and the hours crept into the early morning, the party gradually wound down. Eventually, it was just the close friends left, sitting around in the living room having a much more chill drinking session. By about 3 a.m., the last of the non-overnight guests had departed. The house grew quiet, the music was turned off, and it was just the narrator, Logan, and their friend Cody, who was already starting to doze off on the couch. It was in this newfound quiet that they started to hear it. At first, it was just an occasional faint sound that they couldn't quite place. They dismissed it as one of the normal, inexplicable noises. An old house makes the ice maker in the fridge, the heating kicking on, something mundane. But the sound was persistent, and as they listened more closely, they were able to identify it. It was a rhythmic creaking sound. It seemed to be coming from somewhere else in the house. They got up and walked to the kitchen, but the noise wasn't any louder there. It was as they got closer to the basement door that they realized the sound was coming from downstairs. Logan, being the host, opened the door that led to the basement stairs. The moment he did, the creaking sound became much louder and clearer, echoing up the stairwell. It was the distinct, unmistakable sound of a rocking chair, rocking back and forth, back and forth. The narrator, spooked, told Logan to go down and check it out. Logan, equally spooked, refused. Instead, he leaned into the dark opening and called down, "Yo, who's down there?" The instant the words left his mouth, the creaking stopped. Abruptly, the silence that followed was heavy and unnerving. They stood there at the top of the stairs for a full minute, listening, waiting. Nothing. There were no footsteps, no voices, no indication that anyone was down there at all. Finally, they agreed they had to investigate, but there was no way they were going alone. In a move fueled by a combination of alcohol and genuine fear, they both went to the kitchen and grabbed large knives. They acknowledged how ridiculous it probably looked to drunk guys armed with kitchen knives, preparing to confront a mysterious noise. In reality, they were probably a greater danger to themselves than to any potential intruder. With their makeshift weapons in hand, they crept down the basement stairs. The basement wasn't huge. It was a finished space with a couch, a TV, a small bar area, and a table in the corner. It was also cluttered with various old pieces of furniture and junk, and was generally pretty messy at the time. Their first move was a tactical sweep of the area. They checked behind the couch, in the small storage closets, any possible hiding spot where a person could be concealed. They found nothing. The basement was empty. Their next step was to try and figure out what could have possibly made that sound. Had they imagined it? Was it the house settling in a weird way? And then the narrator saw it. In a dimly lit corner of the room, there was an old wooden rocking chair. He walked over to it, a knot of dread tightening in his stomach. He sat down in the chair, and with a small push of his feet, began to rock. The chair let out a loud, groaning creak. He rocked back and forth a few more times. It was the exact same sound. The same rhythm, the same pitch, the same unmistakable noise they had been hearing from upstairs. He and Logan just looked at each other, their eyes wide. The narrator said he stood up from the chair, and as he did, every single hair on his body stood on end. He had never experienced a feeling like it before. He doesn't think they ever ran faster in their lives than they did in that moment. Scrambling back up the basement stairs and slamming the door shut behind them, fumbling with the lock, they spent the next hour trying to come up with any logical explanation, anything to rationalize what had just happened. But there was none. A window wasn't open to create a draft. The floor wasn't uneven. There was no living soul down there. but something had been moving that rocking chair. Logan kept the basement door locked for days, until his parents came home. They eventually learned the history of the chair. It had belonged to Logan's grandmother, who had passed away many years ago. His mother had kept it for sentimental reasons, moving it to the basement to keep it safe. The narrator says he has never experienced anything else that he would describe as paranormal, either before that night or in the years since. But the memory of that night remains crystal clear. The sound of the methodical, rhythmic creaking, the chilling discovery of the empty chair, and the absolute certainty that they were not alone in that house. It's a story that still sends a shiver down his spine, a New Year's Eve he will never ever forget. Use arrow up and arrow down to select a turn, enter to jump to it, and escape to return to the chat.